Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. In this video, we are going to talk about what critical thinking is, and in particular, we're going to focus on what logic is. Logic is a big part of critical thinking. In general, we could say that to think critically is to appreciate reasons and evidence, to try to use logical methods to arrive at true conclusions. That raises the question, well, what makes a method of thinking logical? We are just going to talk about some basic distinctions in the study of logic that can help one tremendously when it comes to trying to get closer to the truth. All right, so in logic, it's quite common to distinguish between two different kinds of what are called argument, where an argument is simply a set of reasons for accepting a conclusion. So every argument has premises and a conclusion. The premises of the argument are the reasons to accept the conclusion, and the conclusion is just the main point that the argument is trying to prove or show. The two different kinds of argument in logic are deductive arguments and inductive arguments, where the basic difference is that a deductive argument attempts to give you premises that guarantee the truth of a conclusion, in the sense that if those premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Whereas an inductive argument is probabilistic. An inductive argument has premises that attempt to show that the conclusion is likely to be true rather than guaranteed to be true. So here are some examples to consider. This argument has two premises and one conclusion. The premises are all cats are mammals, Sylvie's a cat, therefore, conclusion, Sylvie is a mammal. This is what's called a deductively valid argument. To say that it's deductively valid means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Right? You can just see that by looking at it, that there's no way for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. The conclusion is just guaranteed by the premises. Here's an example of an inductive argument. The Weather Channel says there's a 10% chance of rain today in San Marcos, so it won't rain in San Marcos today. Obviously, that conclusion isn't guaranteed by the premise, but it's made highly likely by the premise. In particular, you could say it's about 90% likely for the conclusion to be true, given the truth of the premise. All right, why does this distinction between deductive arguments and inductive arguments matter? It matters because it informs how we should manage our belief set about the world. More specifically, it suggests that if we are going to be highly confident that something is true, we better have at least a very strong inductive argument for thinking that that thing is true. If we're going to claim to be certain that something is true, then we better have a sound deductive argument for thinking that that thing is true. So the quality of one's argument, whether it's deductively valid or inductively strong, is going to determine how confident one should be in the conclusion that one draws. We should tune our level of confidence to the strength or the validity of the arguments that we have for those beliefs or conclusions. In the reading, I talk about an argument that I call the irrational omnivore argument. That argument has one premise and one conclusion. The premise says animals eat other animals. Therefore, conclusion, it is okay for humans to eat animals. To evaluate that argument, we can ask, is the premise true? That's one question. Another question is, does the premise logically support the conclusion? Okay, so in terms of the truth of the premise, it seems quite obvious, of course, the premise is true. Animals eat other animals. But regarding the second question, does the premise logically support the conclusion? It might be difficult to see this at first glance, but it doesn't support the conclusion. And to see that, we can offer what's called an objection to the argument, where an objection is a kind of explanation for why the argument fails. It could be an explanation for why a premise is false, or why the premise doesn't support the conclusion. The objection that I'm going to consider here, and that we consider in the reading, is of the following sort. It's what's called a kind of counterexample to the argument, where a counterexample to an argument is a kind of scenario where the premise is true in that scenario, but the conclusion's false. Or something that's like quite similar to the premise in terms of the structure of the premise is true, and yet the conclusion's false. So here's the counterexample. Big sharks eat little sharks. That's an example where you have some animals that eat their own kind. Could we conclude from that it's okay for humans to eat other humans? Well, that seems like a bad argument. But notice that the irrational omnivore argument has the same structure as that shark argument. Right? So the lesson here seems to be that we can't use premises about what animals do to draw conclusions about what humans should do or what's okay for humans to do. All right, so a lot of what goes on in philosophy is the attempt to offer arguments to defend this or that conclusion, and then the consideration of objections to that argument. And the point of doing this is, again, not to necessarily like win any kind of game or competition, but rather to try and get closer to the truth. Right? It's very important to consider what objections there are to an argument or to a point of view in order to really test it out. Right? So in this way, this kind of method of offering arguments, considering objections, is quite similar to the scientific method, where you come up with a hypothesis and then you try and test out your hypothesis, where the test, the experiment that you perform, could falsify your hypothesis in the way that an objection can show that an argument is false. So in that way, there's quite a bit of similarity between philosophical reasoning and scientific reasoning. Okay, so we have the difference between deductive arguments and inductive arguments on the table. I want to talk about a specific species of inductive argument with you all for just a moment. And these are called analogical arguments. We're going to be looking at lots of analogical arguments in this class. An analogical argument is an argument that tries to compare two things in order to draw an interesting conclusion. In the history of philosophy, one very famous analogical argument is attributed to a philosopher named William Paley, who was an 18th century thinker, and it's called the watchmaker analogy. So Paley asks us to imagine that we're walking along a beach somewhere and we stumble upon a watch. We pick the watch up, we open it up, and we look inside, and we notice that the interior of the watch has a very complex kind of functional organization to it. It's not like it's just a bunch of random cogs and gears not doing anything. They're organized for the purpose of telling time. Now, if we ask ourselves, did this object just kind of like randomly come together on the beach? Did the parts of the object just randomly coalesce into this functionally organized whole? Or is it more likely that there was an intelligent designer who designed the watch? Well, it seems pretty obvious in this case that the rational thing to conclude is that there was an intelligent designer. All right, now what about the case of, say, complexity in human beings or in animals? You could open up a human being or a gorilla and notice that the interior also has a kind of functional complexity and organization to it. Right? Now, if we would conclude on the beach that the watch probably has an intelligent designer, shouldn't we also conclude that humans and animals also have an intelligent designer? Doesn't that seem more reasonable to believe than the belief that the parts of humans and animals just kind of randomly came together? Okay, so that's the watchmaker analogy. That's an analogical argument. In order to test the strength of that argument, we have to ask questions like, are the two things being compared relevantly similar? And are there any relevant dissimilarities between these two things? Where the two things in question are a watch and then a human being or a biological organism, like an animal or gorilla. right? There are quite a few relevant dissimilarities here between these two things. For instance, humans and animals can reproduce, whereas watches can't. Humans and animals have traits that they can pass on to their progeny that can make their progeny more likely to reproduce in their environment. That's not true of watches. Right? So these relevant dissimilarities give rise to a theory of biological change called Darwin's theory of natural selection. And Darwin's theory gives us a kind of explanation for how you could get complexity in the biological world from very simple systems, like single-celled organisms, for instance. Now, of course, that theory of biological change might be more satisfactory than the appeal to an intelligent designer in the case of biological things. But what if we zoom out from biology on planet Earth and ask questions like, well, isn't the universe kind of functionally organized in an interesting way? Isn't there a complexity and organization in the universe that we can't use Darwin's theory to explain? And what's more likely? That things are just like randomly complex and organized in our universe? Or there's an intelligent designer behind all of what goes on in our universe? All right, we're going to take a look at an argument like that a little bit later on in the semester in Philip Goff's reading, Why Science Points to Purpose. But for now, I just wanted to give you an example of what an analogical argument looks like, since we're going to be evaluating quite a few of them this semester. Okay, last thing in this video, I just want to talk briefly about what fallacies are. Fallacies are bad arguments. They're notoriously bad arguments, so notoriously bad that they've been given specific names. There are specific kinds of fallacy, like begging the question or appealing to the person. And I just want to give you some examples here, just so you can see what a fallacy is. So in the case of begging the question, this is the fallacy of arguing in a circle, right? Where what someone does is they simply repeat the premise of their argument in their conclusion. Okay, so imagine someone arguing that thoughts are not part of the physical world. And then when asked why, well, they say thoughts are in their nature non-physical, so thoughts aren't part of the physical world. That would be an example of begging the question, right? The person has just said the same thing twice. They haven't really offered any independent reason to think that what they say is true. So in order to have a good argument, you can't just restate a point that you've already made. You can't just say the same thing twice. You have to provide some kind of support for the claim. All right, another good example of a fallacy is what's called an appeal to the person, or an ad hominem fallacy. It's often the case that Latin terms are used to describe these fallacies because they were noticed a long time ago when Latin was a dominant language to use in societies. An example of an ad hominem fallacy, a really good one that I've noticed recently. So there's a politician named Bernie Sanders. I'm sure some of you know who Bernie Sanders is, but he ran in the Democratic primaries in 2016 and 2020. He's been a lifelong kind of social democrat who argues for things like universal health care, increasing the federal minimum wage. But recently he was on the Joe Rogan Experience for the second time. And if you look at the comment section of that episode, there are so many comments of the following form. Bernie Sanders flies on a private jet and he lives in $1 million mansion. So you can't believe what he says when he's talking about things like healthcare, raising the minimum wage. He's a hypocrite, right? Now, to say that is to engage in a fallacy called ad hominem. That mode of attack on Bernie Sanders does not address any of the arguments that he's defended for universal health care or for increasing the federal minimum wage. It's simply to attack the person. And in a class like this class, we want to draw a sharp distinction between what a person says and then facts about their character. Where when they deliver an argument, we're going to focus on the content of their argument rather than the content of their character. If we don't do that, then we're not going to be thinking clearly about arguments. So those are just a couple fallacies to keep in mind. There are hundreds and hundreds of fallacies. There's a whole website called yourlogicalfallacyis.com if you care to know more about different kinds of fallacy. But we are just going to talk about those two for the purposes of this specific chapter here.